The air hung still and cold, a silent witness to the end of an empire. On the docks of a forgotten port, a final Roman ship creaked against its moorings, its sails hanging like ghosts in the morning mist. On the deck, the last legionaries of Britannia shivered, not from the chill, but from the unsettling silence of the land they were leaving behind. They had stood guard here for 4 centuries, their sandals treading the soil of a land they had tamed, built roads upon, and connected to the great heart of their empire. Now, that heart was failing, a pulse growing weaker with each passing year. From Rome, the frantic messages had arrived, each one a little more desperate than the last. Come home. The borders are falling. The capital is threatened. We need every soldier, every spear. So, with a final somber glance back at the green hills and the lonely stone villas, the soldiers of the 20th Legion climbed aboard. They had no idea that they were not just leaving a province. They were leaving an entire history to unfold without them. Did you know this was the moment when the island of Britain was cast adrift, no longer a part of the Roman worlds, but a land left to fend for itself in the gathering shadows? This was the beginning of a new story, a dark and uncertain chapter for the peoples who remained. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. As the ships sailed away, the people of Britain, or what was left of Roman Britain, watched with a mix of dread and bewildered relief. For generations, their lives had been woven into the fabric of the Roman system. There were the grand villas with their mosaics and hypocaust heating, the straight roads that crisscrossed the land, and the towns that bustled with trade and Roman law. But that system was now unraveling. The Romanized Britons had grown accustomed to peace, secured by a professional army, but that peace was a mirage now that the soldiers were gone. The island, once a prized possession of the empire, was now an empty plate, inviting anyone with a strong hand to take what they wanted. The absence of Roman authority created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a flurry of chaos. The local leaders, the men who had been content to serve as town magistrates or regional landowners under Roman rule, were now forced to become warlords. The old tribal identities, suppressed for centuries under the Roman boot, began to re-emerge, leading to squabbles over land and influence. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic collapse. It was more like a slow, creaking decay, a grand building with its foundations slowly crumbling. The infrastructure, once a marvel of engineering, began to fall into disrepair. The roads, which had seen legions march and merchants travel, were now overgrown with weeds. The aqueducts that fed the towns ran dry, their stones looted for new, makeshift fortifications. But the biggest threat didn't come from within. It came from the seas, from the ancient enemies the Romans had always kept at bay. The Picts, those painted warriors from beyond Hadrian's Wall, and the Scotti, raiders from Ireland, began to press their attacks with renewed vigor. The famous wall, which had for so long been a symbol of Roman might and a barrier against the wild north, was now little more than a pile of stones, its garrisons abandoned. The raids were relentless and brutal. They weren't just about loot. They were about terror. Villages were burned, people were taken as slaves, and the constant threat made daily life a waking nightmare. Historians still argue whether the last of the legions left on a single day or if it was a more gradual withdrawal. What is certain is that by around 410 AD, the writ of Rome no longer ran in Britain. The Emperor Honorius himself sent a letter to the cities of Britain, effectively telling them to look to your own defenses. It was the final, official acknowledgement of the abandonment. This left the Romano-British leaders in a state of utter desperation. Their world had turned upside down. They were men of villas and libraries, not of sword and shield. They were administrators, not warriors. The Roman way was to rely on a professional army to handle such things, but the army was gone. The Britons had no choice but to try and muster their own forces, but they were disjointed, untrained, and often more interested in fighting each other than a common enemy. The stage was set for a dark age, a time of legends and loss, where the memory of a great empire would slowly fade into myth. The world that had been so carefully constructed by the Romans began to fall apart, brick by crumbling brick. With the legions gone, the great stone villas, once symbols of Roman refinement and order, became targets. Their beautiful mosaic floors were scuffed by the boots of men seeking shelter or plunder. The hypocaust systems, which had once warmed the floors, grew cold and were left to fill with debris. The straight, engineered roads, those famous arteries of the empire, began to sink back into the earth, their paving stones pried up and repurposed for local fortifications. The sense of a unified, singular culture was dissolving, and what was left was a collection of isolated communities, each fending for itself. Imagine for a moment a group of people living in one of these Romano-British towns. They are no longer a part of a grand network. They can no longer expect a letter or a tax collector from Rome to show up on time. The luxuries and the security they had known for centuries were now just fading memories. They might still speak Latin, but with a different lilt, and their clothing might be a mix of Roman and Old British styles. The markets, once filled with goods from across the empire, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, and spices from the East, now offered only local produce. The coins they used, minted in Rome, were growing scarce, forcing a return to a barter economy. It was a slow, unsettling descent into a more primitive way of life. The political landscape was even more chaotic. The old Roman model of a centralized government was replaced by a tangled web of local strongmen. These were men who could command a following, often through their wealth or their lineage from pre-Roman tribes. Some were descendants of Roman officials who now styled themselves as local kings. Others were simply charismatic warlords who had gathered a fighting force to protect their own interests. The land was no longer Britannia, a Roman province. It was now a patchwork of small, competing territories, often in conflict with one another. A trip from one town to the next, once a simple matter of walking a straight road, now became a dangerous journey. Bandits lurked in the overgrown forests, and rival warlords might demand a toll or simply decide to attack. This was the time of the civitates, the Roman-era tribal areas that now functioned as independent states. The people of the Catuvellauni, the Iceni, or the Dobuni, names from a distant past, were once again defining themselves by their local affiliations rather than their Roman identity. The lack of a central authority meant that there was no one to enforce peace, to organize a grand defense, or to settle disputes. It was a fragmented society, a true power vacuum. While the Picts and Scotti were a constant threat, the internal squabbling was just as damaging. As the old saying goes, if you have two men in a field, they'll find a reason to argue, and this was an entire island filled with men who had no one to tell them to stop. The most pressing concern for these isolated communities was survival. They had to organize their own defenses, build their own walls, and gather their own supplies. The grand stone cities, like London and Colchester, were too large to defend and were gradually abandoned, their populations shrinking and huddling within smaller, more defensible areas. Life retreated from the open plains and fertile valleys into fortified hilltops and ancient pre-Roman forts. The old ways were returning. It was a world that was becoming smaller, more insular, and far more dangerous. The memory of Rome was fading, a kind of collective amnesia setting in as the practicalities of survival took precedence over the glories of a bygone age. This was the moment when the Romano-British identity began to fracture, and the stage was set for the arrival of new players from across the sea, looking to claim a piece of the broken land for themselves. The fracturing of Britain was not happening in a vacuum. Across the narrow sea, something was stirring. For centuries, the Roman Empire had maintained a series of coastal forts on both sides of the English Channel, known collectively as the Saxon Shore. This was a name that told its own story, for it was the coastline most threatened by the seafaring Germanic tribes who lived across the North Sea in what is now modern-day northern Germany and Denmark. These tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, were a restless, seafaring people, their longships built for raiding and their hearts set on new lands. For a long time, the might of the Roman fleet and the well-manned forts had kept them in check, but with Rome's withdrawal, the watchtowers stood empty and the sea lanes were open for business. The first visits were just that, raids, small bands of warriors with their long hair and fierce painted shields would land on the beaches, sack a coastal village, take whatever they could carry, and then disappear back into the gray mists from which they came. These were hit-and-run attacks, designed to terrify and loot, not to conquer. The Romano-Britons, without a standing army to defend them, were left to their own devices, huddling together and praying that their village wouldn't be next. But over time, the raids grew bolder and more frequent. The raiders realized that the land was not just undefended, it was fertile and rich. The Romanized Britons had grown soft in their comfortable villas, and their disorganized militias were no match for the hardened warriors of the north. This was a time of immense fear and uncertainty. The sound of a horn blowing on the coast wasn't a signal for help. It was often a warning that the Saxons who had arrived. The term Saxon became a catch-all for these invaders, a single terrifying name for the various tribes who came looking for trouble. The Roman-era historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about these tribes in the late 4th century, noting their reputation for piracy and their ferocity. The British historian Gildas, who we'll meet later, would describe them with a poetic and perhaps slightly biased fury as the loathsome horde of the Saxons, calling them a wolfish band that came greedy as it were for the prey. It's a vivid description that captures the terror they inspired. One of the fascinating aspects of this period is the very name Saxon shore. Historians still argue whether it means the shore from which the Saxons came or the shore that the Saxons were attacking. Given the context, the latter seems more likely, but the ambiguity itself reflects the fluidity of this time. The fact is, the Romans knew these people were a problem long before the final collapse. They just couldn't do anything about it in the end. It's like having a leaky roof and knowing it will eventually give out, but by the time it happens, you're too busy putting out a fire in the living room to fix it. The raids were a harbinger of things to come. The initial forays were not about permanent settlement, but as the British internal conflicts worsened, some of the raiders began to see an opportunity not just for quick wealth, but for a new home. The landscape of Britain was changing, and the first steps toward a true Anglo-Saxon settlement were being taken. The stage was set for a dramatic turning point, one that would change the island forever, thanks to a desperate and perhaps foolish decision by a leader of the beleaguered Britons. The desperate state of Britain led to a desperate choice, one that would echo through the centuries as a tale of folly and betrayal. The figure at the center of this story is Vortigern, a name that means great king in the Old Welsh language. Historians still argue over whether Vortigern was a single person or a title held by multiple leaders, but the legend paints him as a powerful yet short-sighted ruler of the Britons. Faced with the relentless raids from the Picts in the north and the Scotti from the west, and with his own people fragmented and disorganized, Vortigern looked for a solution outside of Britain itself. He believed a good offense was a better defense, and decided to hire some of the very people who had been raiding his shores to protect them. His choice of mercenaries was the Anglo-Saxons. According to the Venerable Bede, writing a few centuries later, Vortigern invited two brothers, the Jutish leaders Hengist and Horsa, to come to Britain. Their names, fittingly, mean stallion and horse, as if they were symbols of the untamed, powerful force they represented. The deal was simple. Hengist and Horsa would bring their warriors to Britain, and in exchange for land and payment, they would fight Vortigern's enemies. The Britons, the story goes, welcomed them, seeing them as saviors who would bring an end to the terror of the raids. For a time, it seemed to work. The Saxon warriors, with their fearsome longships and battle-hardened resolve, were highly effective against the Picts and the Scotti. They pushed the northern raiders back and secured the coastal areas, bringing a fragile, fleeting sense of peace. But as with any contract with a hungry wolf, the arrangement was bound to go wrong. The Saxons saw the land they were fighting for, and they liked what they saw. It was a rich, green island, far more fertile than their marshy homelands. They began to demand more land and more payment. Vortigern, perhaps feeling a little too secure, either refused or couldn't meet their demands. A minor disagreement, perhaps about a land grant or an unpaid stipend, turned into a monumental betrayal. The Saxons, who had been invited as guests and protectors, now turned their spears on their hosts. This wasn't a slow-burning conflict. It was a sudden and brutal turn. They ravaged the countryside they were supposed to be defending, burning down the very towns they had sworn to protect. The Britons, who had been saved from one enemy, now found themselves facing a new one they had foolishly brought into their own home. This betrayal, often called the Betrayal of the Long Knives, is a pivotal moment in the history of Britain. The Anglo-Saxons now had a foothold on the island, not as raiders, but as conquerors. They had seen the weakness of the Britons, and they had no intention of leaving. The historical sources for this period are thin and often mixed with legend, so it's hard to separate fact from myth. But what is undeniable is that around the mid-5th century, a new wave of Germanic migration and conquest began in earnest. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes started to settle, not just raid. Their names would eventually give the island a new name, England, the land of the Angles. It was the moment that the ancient British culture began its long and painful retreat to the western and northern fringes of the island. Vortigern's short-sightedness had, according to the legends, cost his people their homeland. The betrayal of Vortigern and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon expansion plunged Britain into a new period of warfare. But this conflict was different. It wasn't a matter of fending off raids. It was a matter of survival. The initial chaos was profound, as the Britons, accustomed to Roman peace, were ill-equipped to handle this kind of total war. Villages were put to the torch, and the Romanized towns, with their straight streets and public baths, became dangerous places to be. The archaeological record shows a sharp decline in Roman-style pottery and goods, replaced by simpler, more locally produced items, a clear sign of the economic and social collapse. The Anglo-Saxons were not interested in maintaining the Roman way of life. They were interested in making the land their own. They didn't build new villas. They built timber halls and clustered settlements, bringing with them their own customs, gods, and languages. This period of violent expansion led to what historians sometimes call the Great Migration. It wasn't a single event, but a slow and grinding process. The Anglo-Saxons pushed westward, slowly but surely, forcing the Britons to either submit, flee, or fight. The Britons who were defeated often found themselves on the wrong side of the new social order, becoming serfs or slaves. Many others simply fled, moving west to the highlands of Wales and Cornwall, or even sailing across the Channel to what is now known as Brittany in France. The Anglo-Saxons were a tough, practical people, and they had a clear goal: to farm the land, to settle down, and to establish new kingdoms. The names of their leaders, men like Ella of Sussex or Cerdic of Wessex, began to appear in the scant historical records and the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, marking the start of a new, non-Roman history for the island. The conflict wasn't a one-sided affair. While the Anglo-Saxons had the initial advantage of being hardened warriors and having a unified purpose, the Britons fought back. This period is filled with tales of British resistance, some of which are likely rooted in historical fact. The resistance was not centralized. It was a series of local struggles, led by various British chieftains and warlords. They would ambush Saxon warbands, fortify old Roman ruins, and try to make the conquest as costly as possible. These were the last embers of Romano-British society, flickering in the darkness. The fighting was brutal and relentless, a struggle for every inch of land. This was a battle for the soul of the island, a contest between two very different cultures. On one side, the Britons, with their fading memory of Roman order and their nascent Christianity. On the other, the Anglo-Saxons, with their pagan traditions, their war bands, and their desire for a new home. The Anglo-Saxons began to carve out their own kingdoms, each a small, independent state with its own king and its own laws. They were not unified. They were often in conflict with each other, a detail that would later prove to be a saving grace for the beleaguered Britons. The names of these kingdoms, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Kent, are familiar to us today because they are the very names that would eventually become the foundation of a unified England. They were named after the peoples who settled them: the West Saxons, the South Saxons, the East Saxons, and the Jutes of Kent. This gradual settlement and consolidation of power marked the end of the Romano-British era in a large part of the island and the beginning of a new chapter, the Anglo-Saxon Age. It was a time of immense change, a kind of great reset for the island, where the old was torn down to make way for the new. The very name of the land would soon change, a testament to the fact that the island's destiny was no longer in the hands of the Britons, but in the hands of the people who had sailed across the sea in their longships. The stage was set for the rise of the next great hero of the Britons, a man who would lead the resistance and whose name would become legend. The despair of the Britons was not absolute. From the chaos of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, a new leader arose, a figure shrouded in a mix of history and legend, Ambrosius Aurelianus. He was a man of Roman lineage, a descendant of the old Roman elite who had not fled the island. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was a unifier, a man who saw that the only hope for the Britons was to set aside their internal squabbles and stand together against the common enemy. Ambrosius is mentioned by the historian Gildas as the leader of the British resistance. Gildas describes him as a modest man who alone of the Romans had survived the shock of this terrible storm. This gives us a tantalizing glimpse of a real historical figure, someone who was able to rally the scattered remnants of Romano-British society. Ambrosius Aurelianus wasn't a king in the traditional sense. He was more like a war leader, a commander who could organize and lead an army. He understood Roman tactics and strategy, which gave him a significant advantage over the less organized Saxon warbands. He was also a Christian, which gave him a powerful moral and spiritual authority in a time of great crisis. He wasn't just fighting for land, he was fighting for a way of life, a culture, and a faith. His rise marked a turning point in the conflict. The Britons, who had been retreating and losing ground for decades, now began to fight back with a newfound purpose and a glimmer of hope. Ambrosius's forces were likely a mix of professional soldiers, local militias, and brave volunteers. They were fighting a desperate war, but for the first time in a long time, they were fighting with a plan. The campaign led by Ambrosius was not about reconquering the entire island. It was about containment, about stopping the Anglo-Saxon advance and securing what was left of British territory. He likely used a strategy of mobile warfare, ambushing Saxon warbands, cutting their supply lines, and fighting them on ground of his own choosing. This period is often referred to as the Age of Ambrosius in some historical accounts, a testament to his central role in the resistance. He was the hero they needed, a beacon of light in a very dark time. He was a man who understood that courage alone wasn't enough. You also needed discipline and a good plan. The Britons, with Ambrosius's leadership, were able to achieve a number of victories, pushing the Saxons back from some of the land they had conquered. Historians still debate the exact nature of Ambrosius Aurelianus's campaigns. The historical record from this period is incredibly sparse, a blank page waiting for someone to write on it. But what we do have in the writings of Gildas suggests a real person who made a real difference. Gildas, writing around a century after the events, doesn't mention any fantastical battles or magical swords. He just speaks of a man who rallied his people and led them to victory. This victory, or more accurately, a series of victories, led to a prolonged period of peace. It was a time when the British resistance was at its strongest, and the Anglo-Saxon advance was, for a while at least, halted. This lull in the fighting, this period of relative calm, is a testament to the effectiveness of Ambrosius Aurelianus's leadership. The stage was now set for the most legendary of all British victories, a battle that would be forever linked to the name of a different kind of hero, one whose name we still whisper today. The period of relative peace, brought about by Ambrosius Aurelianus, culminated in a legendary battle that would define the British resistance for generations, the Battle of Mount Badon. Historians still argue whether this was a single, massive battle or a series of smaller skirmishes, but what is certain is that a major victory was won by the Britons, a victory so decisive that it halted the Anglo-Saxon advance for decades. The location of Mount Badon is another great mystery. Was it in the southwest of Britain, in modern-day Bath, or was it somewhere in the Midlands, near the old Roman forts? The answer is lost to time, but the importance of the event itself is not. According to Gildas, the British monk we met earlier, this victory was so profound that it gave his people a lasting peace, one that lasted from the year of the siege of Badon Hill to the present day, a period of around 44 years. The accounts of the battle are thin, but they paint a picture of a well-organized British force defeating the fragmented Anglo-Saxon warbands. The Britons likely used their knowledge of the terrain and Roman military tactics to their advantage. They may have forced the Saxons to fight on a hill, a classic defensive position, or ambushed them in a narrow pass. Whatever the method, the result was a resounding success for the Britons. The Anglo-Saxons, for the first time in a long time, were not just defeated, they were routed. They were forced to retreat, and their forward progress across the island was stopped cold. This victory was a moment of immense pride for the Britons, a sign that they were not a dying people, but a resilient one. It was a chance for them to rebuild, to re-establish their communities, and to live without the constant fear of raids and invasion. But here is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Gildas, our main historical source, attributes the victory to Ambrosius Aurelianus, but later chroniclers like Nennius, writing in the 9th century, added a new hero to the mix, King Arthur. In Nennius's account, Arthur is the one who led the Britons at the Battle of Mount Badon, and he is a Christian warrior who carried the cross on his shield, a detail that was later woven into the great legends we know today. Historians still argue whether King Arthur was a real person. Some believe he was a Celtic chieftain, others a Roman cavalry officer, and some believe he was a pure myth, a symbol of the British struggle for survival. What is not debated is the power of the legend itself. The story of Arthur, the once and future king, grew out of this period of British resistance. The victory at Mount Badon became the keystone of his legend, the great military triumph that cemented his place in history. The peace that followed Mount Badon was a golden age for the Britons. They were able to consolidate their kingdoms in the west and north of the island, and the Anglo-Saxons were contained to the east. The Britons were a culture on the defensive, but they were a culture that had learned to survive. The period of peace, however, was also a period of stagnation. Gildas, writing about this time, laments the fact that the Britons, freed from the fear of their enemies, fell into squabbling and moral decay. It's a classic theme in history that a people who are at peace might not always be at their best. But the peace held, and it was a testament to the victory at Mount Badon. It was a moment when the light of the Britons shone brightest, a moment that would be forever remembered, even as the shadows began to lengthen once again. With the Anglo-Saxon advance checked by the victory at Mount Badon, the Britons entered a new phase of their history. This was not a time of reconquest or grand expansion, but rather a period of consolidation. The fragmented Romano-British society, which had been so close to collapse, now had a chance to coalesce into more stable regional kingdoms. These were the so-called sub-Roman or post-Roman kingdoms, and they were a fascinating blend of old and new. They clung to the last vestiges of Roman culture. Perhaps a king would use a Roman-style title like Dux or Rex, while governing with a blend of ancient Celtic traditions and the new realities of the time. The names of some of these kingdoms have come down to us, like Gwynedd in what is now North Wales, and Powys in the Midlands. These were not the grand empires of the past. They were smaller, often feuding states, but they were a clear sign of British survival. The political situation was a complex mosaic of alliances, betrayals, and dynastic marriages. The leaders of these kingdoms were often fierce, pragmatic men who knew that their survival depended on their ability to command respect and defend their borders. They were not just warriors, they were also administrators, judges, and sometimes even poets, for the Celtic culture placed a high value on the spoken word and the power of myth. Their halls were not the great stone villas of Rome, but the timber and wattle and daub structures of their ancestors. Life in these kingdoms was more rural and less sophisticated than in the Roman era, but it was also more self-sufficient and more distinctly British. They were a people who had been forged in the fires of invasion and had emerged with a new, stronger identity. The lasting peace, however, brought its own challenges. The historian Gildas, writing during this period, was deeply critical of the British kings, whom he accused of moral corruption and endless squabbling. He called them tyrants and dogs. In his work, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, is a scathing denunciation of their behavior. His critique suggests that while the military threat from the Saxons had subsided, the internal political feuds were as destructive as ever. It's a reminder that even in times of peace, human nature can create its own conflicts. It also offers a rare glimpse into the mindset of a contemporary observer, someone who saw the promise of the victory at Mount Badon being squandered by the very people who should have been building a new nation. The existence of these sub-Roman kingdoms is a crucial piece of the puzzle. They show that the Britons did not simply disappear after the Anglo-Saxon invasion. They retreated, yes, but they also adapted and survived. They maintained their own languages, their own laws, and their own culture. The legacy of these kingdoms is still visible today in the place names, the languages, and the folklore of Wales and Cornwall. This was a time when the Britons were not just holding on, they were establishing a new way of life. The peace that Ambrosius and perhaps Arthur had won for them was being used, however imperfectly, to build something new from the ruins of the old. It was a time of fragile calm, a quiet before the storm that would eventually return with a renewed ferocity. The story of Britain was not just a story of invasion, but also a story of a people who, against all odds, managed to hold on to a piece of their past and carry it into the future. The peace won at Mount Badon and the fragile stability of the sub-Roman kingdoms allowed for a different kind of change to take root, a spiritual one. While the pagan Anglo-Saxons were settling in the east, the Britons of the west and north were solidifying their Christian identity. They had been Christian since the Roman times, a legacy of the empire that had long since departed. The faith, however, was not like the organized hierarchical Church of Rome. It was a more ascetic, monastic form of Christianity, deeply rooted in the Celtic world. It was a Christianity of saints and hermits, of remote monasteries and simple stone churches. This form of faith was passed down through generations, a spiritual thread that connected them to their past and gave them strength in a time of uncertainty. This was the age of the Welsh saints. Men like Saint David, Saint Illtyd, and Saint Cadoc established monasteries that were not just centers of worship, but also centers of learning and culture. These monasteries became the repositories of knowledge, the keepers of Latin texts, and the places where the old stories and genealogies were recorded. They were also the places where new stories, like those of King Arthur, were beginning to take shape. The monks who lived and worked in these places saw the world through a Christian lens, and they often interpreted the British victories and defeats as a sign of God's favor or disfavor. They were not just documenting history, they were giving it a spiritual meaning. The contrast with the pagan Anglo-Saxons could not have been more stark. While the Saxons worshipped gods like Woden and Thor, the Britons prayed to a single Christian god. This Christian identity was a powerful tool for the Britons. It gave them a sense of unity and a moral purpose in their struggle against the Anglo-Saxons. It was a part of their identity that the invaders could not conquer. It was a shield against the cultural assimilation that was happening in the East. The Britons saw themselves as a Christian people fighting against a pagan horde. This made the conflict more than just a struggle for land. It was a spiritual battle, a clash of two very different worldviews. Historians still debate how widespread Christianity was among the Britons. Was it just a belief held by the elite, or was it a faith that permeated all levels of society? The evidence, however, suggests that it was a deeply ingrained part of their identity. The Anglo-Saxons, meanwhile, remained staunchly pagan. They brought with them their own gods and their own belief systems, and they had no interest in adopting the faith of the people they were conquering. Their gods were gods of war, of the sky, and of the harvest, and their religious practices were focused on placating these powerful forces. This religious divide would become a central theme in the story of Britain, a point of conflict and a point of distinction between the two peoples. It was a silent war, fought with ideas and beliefs rather than swords and spears, a war that would eventually be decided by a different kind of invasion, a peaceful one that would arrive on the eastern shores of the island centuries later. In the midst of this turbulent era, one figure stands out as our primary, though not entirely unbiased, guide through the shadows: the British monk Gildas. Writing in the mid-6th century, Gildas authored a work known as De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, which translates to On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. This is one of the very few written sources we have from a contemporary perspective, and it paints a vivid, if not entirely flattering, picture of his time. Gildas was not a historian in the modern sense. He was a moralist, a preacher, and a prophet. He saw the Anglo-Saxon invasion as God's punishment for the sins of the Britons. To him, the British kings and people were corrupt, lazy, and morally bankrupt, and the Saxons were simply the instrument of divine wrath. Gildas's writing is filled with passionate, often fiery language. He names a handful of kings, whom he calls tyrants, and he accuses them of all sorts of vices, from greed to murder. This is our only real glimpse into the political landscape of the sub-Roman kingdoms, and it's a depressing one. He speaks of a period of peace after a great victory at a place he calls Badon Hill, but he laments that this peace led not to a spiritual revival, but to further moral decay. This is a classic biblical theme, the idea that prosperity can lead to a fall from grace. It's a bit like a parent scolding their children for misbehaving after a holiday, except in this case, the punishment is a full-scale invasion. One of the most valuable aspects of Gildas's work is his mention of Ambrosius Aurelianus and the Battle of Mount Badon. While he doesn't give us many details, he confirms that these events were real and that they led to a period of peace. He's not a fan of the hero worship that might have been starting to form around these figures. He's much more interested in the spiritual lessons of their lives. He's also our primary source for the early stages of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, even if he doesn't name the invaders. He refers to them as a band of Saxons who were invited by a proud tyrant, a reference to Vortigern. His account is so important because it's a window, albeit a small and cloudy one, into a period that is otherwise almost entirely dark. Historians still argue about the reliability of Gildas. Was he exaggerating for effect? Was he letting his religious beliefs color his view of events? The answer is likely yes to both. But even with those biases, his work is a priceless treasure. It's a lament for a lost world, a world where the Roman way of life had been replaced by chaos and moral decay. It's the voice of a man who saw his culture being consumed by a new one, and he believed it was his own people's fault. He was a man who saw the end of an era, and he wasn't happy about it at all. His work, however, became a touchstone for later historians, like Bede, and it's thanks to his laments that we have any hope of understanding this tumultuous period. Without Gildas, this part of the story would be a complete blank. With the Anglo-Saxons contained to the east, the Britons had a chance to focus on their own survival, which meant building and defending. While the grand Roman villas were being abandoned or turned into rubble, the Britons were constructing a different kind of defensive network. The most important of these were the hill forts, ancient earthworks that had been used by their ancestors for centuries. They were not as technologically advanced as Roman fortifications, but they were perfectly suited to the kind of guerrilla warfare the Britons were forced to fight. These forts were often perched on high ground, giving their defenders a clear view of the surrounding countryside and making them difficult to assault. Inside their walls, the Britons would huddle together, a small community with its own chieftain, its own livestock, and its own simple buildings. The Britons also built new walls, not the grand stone walls of the Roman era, but often simple earthworks and palisades designed to protect a small community or a single homestead. They were practical, not pretty. They were built for survival, not for show. The archaeological evidence from this period shows a decline in building with stone and a return to building with timber, wattle, and daub, materials that were readily available and didn't require the kind of engineering expertise that had been lost with the Romans. This was a society that had to learn to live with less, to adapt to a new, more dangerous world. The Britons were not just building walls, they were also fortifying their identities. Their culture, which had been pushed to the fringes, began to flourish in the areas where they still held power. Their language, a form of Brythonic Celtic, was spoken in the hill forts and the valleys of the west. Their stories, their myths, and their legends were told around the fire at night, and they began to take on a new, more heroic tone, a tone that celebrated their resistance against the pagan invaders. This was the birth of the Welsh identity. The Britons of the West began to see themselves as distinct from the Saxons of the East, not just geographically, but culturally and linguistically. They were no longer just Britons. They were the Cymri, the fellow countrymen, a name that they still use for themselves today. This period also saw the development of a unique legal system, a blend of old Celtic laws and the Roman law they had inherited. These laws were not written down in the formal Roman style, but were passed down through generations by wise men and judges. They governed everything from land disputes to the punishment for a stolen cow. This system was designed to keep a fragile society from falling apart and to settle conflicts without resorting to violence. It was a testament to the fact that even in a time of great upheaval, people still needed a sense of order and justice. The walls of the Briton were not just made of earth and wood, they were also made of culture and law. They were the invisible barriers that separated them from the new Anglo-Saxon world that was being built to the east. This was a time of survival, of adaptation, and of the birth of a new identity. The peace was fragile, and it would not last forever, but for a few decades, the Britons had a chance to catch their breath and to build a new society from the ashes of the old. It was a testament to their resilience and their ability to endure. The peace won at Mount Badon and the subsequent rise of the sub-Roman kingdoms did not mean the Anglo-Saxons had given up. Far from it. While the Britons were busy consolidating their power in the west, the Anglo-Saxons were doing the same in the east. They weren't just a collection of raiding parties anymore. They were a people putting down deep roots, creating a new society, and forming kingdoms. These were the kingdoms of the so-called Heptarchy, a term meaning 7 kingdoms that was later coined by historians, even though the number of kingdoms often fluctuated. These included Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. The peace was an uneasy one, a sort of cold war between two peoples. The Anglo-Saxons used this time to increase their numbers, both through migration and through natural growth. Their settlements, a mix of farming and small craft industries, were growing, and their population was expanding. They were a dynamic, ambitious people, and their chieftains were constantly vying for power and influence. While the Britons were fighting amongst themselves, the Anglo-Saxons were building something new, a new culture based on their Germanic traditions and their pagan beliefs. They had their own laws, their own social structure based on a hierarchy of kings, nobles, and freemen, and their own poets, who sang of the glories of war and the deeds of their ancestors. The Anglo-Saxons were also beginning to learn the art of war on a larger scale. They were no longer just raiding parties, they were organized armies. They had a clear goal: to expand their territories and to push the Britons further west. The Peace of Mount Badon eventually began to fray. The Anglo-Saxons, having consolidated their power, were ready to move again. The pressure began to mount on the Britons. This time, however, the Britons had no Ambrosius or Arthur to unite them. Their internal squabbles, which Gildas had so lamented, were now a serious weakness. They were a fragmented people, unable to mount a unified defense against a new, more powerful Anglo-Saxon threat. The renewed Saxon advance was relentless. The kingdom of Wessex, in the south, began to push westward, slowly but surely, consuming the British territories in Cornwall and along the southern coast. The kingdom of Northumbria, in the north, began to push west as well, putting pressure on the British kingdoms of Raigte and Strathclyde. The British kingdoms, with their fractured leadership and their limited resources, were unable to hold back the tide. One by one, their territories were absorbed, their people were assimilated, and their culture was suppressed. The Anglo-Saxons were not just conquering land, they were erasing a history. This period of renewed conflict marked the beginning of the end for the British kingdoms in much of what is now England. The Anglo-Saxons had learned from their past defeats, and they were now a more formidable force. The Britons, meanwhile, were on the back foot, fighting a war on multiple fronts with no central command. The Peace of Mount Badon, once a source of hope, was now just a distant memory. The stage was set for the final act of the Anglo-Saxon conquest, a conquest that would ultimately lead to the formation of a unified English identity and the permanent retreat of the Britons to the western fringes of the island, where they would eventually find a new name for themselves. The fragmented world of the Heptarchy was a constant struggle for dominance, and one of the most powerful players to emerge from this era was the Kingdom of Mercia. Situated in the heart of England, Mercia was a landlocked kingdom. Its power derived not from the sea, but from its fertile farmlands and its aggressive, expansionist kings. One of the most formidable of these kings was a man named Penda, a name that has come down to us as a symbol of pagan defiance. Penda ruled Mercia from around 626 to 655, and during his reign, he was a thorn in the side of the Christian kings who were beginning to gain influence in other parts of the island. He was a ruthless warrior, a skilled diplomat, and a man who refused to abandon his old gods for the new Christian faith. Penda's reign was a constant series of wars. He fought against the Britons, pushing them further back into Wales, but his most famous conflicts were with the Christian kingdoms of Northumbria in the north. Northumbria, under kings like Edwin and Oswald, was a rising power, and its rulers were keen to spread their Christian faith and their political influence. Penda saw them as a direct threat to his power and his way of life. He was a traditionalist who saw the new religion as a foreign imposition, something that would weaken the martial spirit of his people. He was a force to be reckoned with, a kind of last stand for the old pagan ways of the Anglo-Saxons. Penda's most famous victory was at the Battle of Maserfield in 642, where he defeated and killed the Christian king Oswald of Northumbria. This was a huge blow to the Christian cause and a moment of triumph for the pagan Mercians. Penda's victory sent a clear message. The old gods were not dead, and the new religion would not have an easy time of it. He was a king who ruled by fear and force, and his power was absolute. He was a king who was not interested in conversion. He was interested in conquest. He was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to run into in a dark alley, or for that matter, a sunlit battlefield. Historians still debate Penda's legacy. Was he a savage barbarian, as the Christian chroniclers would have us believe, or was he a pragmatic ruler who simply wanted to preserve his kingdom and his culture from a foreign religion? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. He was a product of his time, a king who had to be ruthless to survive in a very dangerous world. He was a man who understood power, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep it. His reign was a kind of last gasp for the pagan Anglo-Saxons, a time when the old gods of the north still had a king to champion their cause. But the tide of history was turning, and Penda's defiance, however fierce, would not be enough to stop it. The new religion was spreading, and its influence was growing with every passing year. Penda was the final, fiery holdout, a king who would die as he lived, fighting against a world that was leaving him behind. The story of King Penda and the pagan Mercian defiance finds its perfect foil in the story of King Oswald of Northumbria. Unlike Penda, Oswald was a devout Christian, a man who saw his faith not as a weakness, but as a source of strength. His story is one of exile, return, and triumph, and it's a testament to the growing power of Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon world. Oswald, a prince of Northumbria, was forced into exile as a young man after his father was killed in battle. He fled north to the Celtic kingdom of Dalriada in modern-day Scotland, where he was converted to Christianity by Irish monks. This was a different kind of Christianity from the one that was starting to take root in the south, a more ascetic, monastic version, and it would leave a lasting impression on Oswald. When he finally returned to Northumbria to reclaim his throne, he did so not just as a warrior king, but as a Christian king. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Heavenfield in 634, where he defeated his rival, the pagan king Cadwallon of Gwynedd, a British king who had allied with the Mercians. Before the battle, Oswald is said to have erected a wooden cross and led his men in prayer. This was a powerful symbol, a sign that this was not just a war for land, but a war for the soul of the people. Oswald's victory was seen as a divine sign, a testament to the power of the Christian God. It was a kind of religious one-upmanship, and it worked. After his victory, Oswald set about spreading his faith throughout his kingdom. He invited an Irish monk named Aidan to establish a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, a place that would become a beacon of learning and spirituality for centuries. Aidan was a humble, compassionate man who traveled on foot, talking to the people and winning their hearts and minds. He was a different kind of missionary than the ones who would arrive later, a missionary who was more interested in gentle persuasion than grand pronouncements. This Celtic form of Christianity, with its emphasis on monastic life and quiet contemplation, would flourish under Oswald's rule. Oswald's story, however, ends in tragedy. He was killed in battle by the pagan king Penda of Mercia at the Battle of Maserfield in 642. His death was a huge blow to the Christian cause, and it showed that the old ways were not dead yet. But his legacy lived on. He was revered as a saint, a martyr who had died fighting for his faith. His story, as told by Bede, the monk who wrote a history of the English Church, became a powerful tool for spreading Christianity throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Oswald was a kind of Christian Arthur, a king who had won great victories and whose memory inspired others. He was a man who showed that faith and power could go hand in hand, and his story helped to pave the way for the next great wave of Christian influence that would sweep across the land. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons was not a single event, but a slow process that unfolded over more than a century. While the Celtic Christianity of men like Oswald was spreading from the north, a new, more organized wave of evangelism was about to hit the southern shores. This was the Gregorian mission, a mission sent directly by Pope Gregory the Great in Rome. The man he chose to lead it was a humble monk named Augustine. In 597, Augustine and a small band of monks landed in the kingdom of Kent, a kingdom ruled by King Ethelbert, a powerful man whose wife, Bertha, was a Christian Frankish princess. Her influence, and the fact that the men who had defeated the Britons were now being presented with a new, more powerful faith, made Ethelbert more receptive to the missionaries. Augustine and his monks were a different kind of Christian. They were part of the Roman Church, with its clear hierarchy and its emphasis on a centralized authority. They were not wandering hermits like the Celtic monks. They were here to establish a formal church structure with bishops and cathedrals. Augustine met with King Ethelbert, and the king, a shrewd and pragmatic man, gave them a place to live and permission to preach. He didn't convert immediately, but he was open to their message. He could see that this new faith was not just about saving souls. It was about connecting his kingdom to the great network of Europe, a network that was once Roman and was now Christian. The arrival of Augustine was a major turning point. It marked the formal beginning of the Roman Church's presence in England, a presence that would eventually supplant the Celtic Christianity of the North. The two forms of Christianity were different in their practices. The Celtic Church had a different way of calculating the date of Easter and a different hairstyle for their monks, among other things. But they were both Christian. The Roman model, however, was a more powerful and more unified system. It was a model that was perfectly suited for the kind of large, organized kingdoms that were beginning to emerge in the Anglo-Saxon world. King Ethelbert's conversion was a huge victory for Augustine and for Rome. The king's decision was a signal to his people that the old gods were on the way out and a new era was beginning. The conversion of a king was a powerful symbol, a sign that the gods themselves had been replaced. The Christian missionaries were also good at selling their faith. They didn't just talk about heaven and hell. They also brought with them the Roman alphabet and the knowledge of how to read and write. This was a powerful tool, a way to record laws, to write down history, and to communicate with the outside world. The Anglo-Saxons, a people with a great oral tradition, were now getting the tools to create a written one. The arrival of Augustine was the moment when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to look outward to connect with the rest of Europe and to become a part of the greater Christian world. The foundations of a new, unified identity were being laid, not with a sword, but with a cross. The two different forms of Christianity, the Celtic one from the north and the Roman one from the south, could not coexist forever. They had different practices, different ways of calculating the date of Easter, and a different monastic style. This was more than just a theological squabble. It was a matter of authority. The Roman Church was centralized, with the Pope at the top, while the Celtic Church was a more decentralized, with the abbots of the monasteries holding more power than the bishops. The growing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, especially the powerful ones, needed a unified religious system. A king could not be a Roman Christian one day and a Celtic one the next. The confusion was a threat to their authority and to the stability of their kingdoms. A decision had to be made. The moment of decision came in 664 at the Synod of Whitby. It was a kind of religious summit held at the monastery of Whitby, an important center of Celtic Christianity in the Kingdom of Northumbria. The King of Northumbria at the time, Oswald, was a man who had been raised in the Celtic tradition, but was now being pulled in two different directions. His wife was a Roman Christian, and his son was a Celtic Christian, a family divided by faith. He decided to call a synod, a council, to settle the matter once and for all. It was a kind of spiritual debate, a showdown between the two different forms of Christianity. On one side were the proponents of the Celtic tradition, led by Colman, the abbot of Lindisfarne. He argued that their traditions came directly from St. John the Apostle and were a part of the ancient Christian heritage. On the other side were the proponents of the Roman tradition, led by Wilfrid, a charismatic English priest who had been to Rome and was a staunch supporter of the Roman Church. He argued that the Roman tradition came from Saint Peter, the chief of the apostles, the one to whom Jesus had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The debate came down to a simple question. Which saint had more authority, St. John or St. Peter? The moment of decision came when Wilfrid asked Oswald if he had ever heard of St. Peter having the keys to heaven. When Oswald said yes, Wilfrid sealed the deal. He argued that if St. Peter had the keys, it was better to be in his good graces, lest the gates of heaven be locked to them. It was a clever, if not entirely theological argument, and it worked. Oswiu, a pragmatic king who understood the value of a single authority, decided in favor of the Roman tradition. The decision at the Synod of Whitby was a monumental one. It meant that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England would align themselves with the Roman Church, connecting them to the great political and cultural network of continental Europe. The Celtic monks, with their simple monastic ways, were out. The Roman bishops, with their clear hierarchy and their allegiance to the Pope, were in. The decision was a bit like choosing between a local band you grew up with and a world-famous orchestra. You might love the local band, but the orchestra can play on a much bigger stage. The Synod of Whitby marked a major step toward the unification of England, a unification that would not just be political, but also religious and cultural. The political landscape of the Heptarchy was a constant struggle for supremacy, and the kingdom that most consistently rose to the top was Mercia. After the death of the pagan king Penda, Mercia slowly converted to Christianity, but its ambition did not wane. Its most famous and powerful king was a man named Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796. Offa was a man of immense power, a king who had no qualms about using both military might and shrewd diplomacy to expand his kingdom and his influence. He was a ruthless ruler, but he was also a pragmatist who saw the value of a strong, unified kingdom. He was so powerful that he was often seen as the de facto king of all of southern England. Charlemagne himself, the great emperor of the Franks, addressed Offa as an equal, a testament to his power and his reputation. But Offa's most lasting legacy wasn't a military victory. It was a physical monument. He is credited with building Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork that stretched for over 150 miles along the border between his kingdom and the Welsh kingdoms to the west. This was not a wall in the Roman style. It was a ditch and a rampart, a huge undertaking that must have required an enormous amount of labor. Historians still argue about its exact purpose. Was it a defensive fortification, a kind of Great Wall of England? Or was it a more symbolic barrier, a way of marking a clear border and showing the Welsh that their land was separate from his? The most likely answer is that it was a bit of both. It was a clear statement of Mercian power, a line drawn in the earth that told the Welsh, this far and no farther. The creation of Offa's Dyke was a pivotal moment in the history of Britain. It was the physical manifestation of the long and painful retreat of the Britons. The Dyke was a permanent marker, a line that separated the Anglo-Saxon world of England from the Celtic world of Wales. It was a moment when the two cultures, after centuries of conflict, were finally forced to acknowledge a boundary. The Dyke itself was a marvel of engineering, a project on a scale not seen in Britain since the Romans. It was a sign that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were no longer just a collection of warring tribes. They were becoming a unified state, with a king who could command the resources to build a monument of this scale. Offa's reign was a high point for Mercia and a low point for the Welsh. He pushed the Welsh back from the Midlands and secured Mercia's western border. He was a king who understood that power was not just about winning battles. It was about building things, about creating a sense of permanence and a clear boundary between himself and his enemies. Offa's Dyke, even today, is a testament to his power and his vision. It's a reminder of a time when the Anglo-Saxon world was ascendant and the British world was in retreat. The peace it brought was a kind of uneasy truce, a moment of fragile calm before a new storm would arrive from the sea, a storm that would threaten to sweep away everything that Offa and his predecessors had built. The fragile peace that King Offa had created, a peace secured by his mighty Dyke, was about to be shattered by a new and terrifying force. From the dark, cold seas to the north, a new kind of longship was beginning to appear on the horizon. These ships were crewed by the Vikings, a name that struck fear into the hearts of all who heard it. These were not the raiders of old, who would come and go. These were a new kind of invader, a relentless professional force who saw the rich, fertile lands of England as a prime target for plunder and settlement. The Anglo-Saxons, who had so recently been the invaders, were now about to become the invaded. The first recorded Viking raid in England was in 793 at the monastery of Lindisfarne, the very place where Oswald and Badon had brought Christianity to Northumbria. The sight of the Viking longships appearing out of the mist must have been a terrifying one. The monks who had lived a life of quiet contemplation and prayer were no match for these fierce warriors. The Vikings sacked the monastery, stealing its gold and its sacred books, and they killed or enslaved the monks. This was a brutal and shocking event, one that sent a clear signal to all of England. No place was safe. It was a sign that a new, darker age was about to begin. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, who had so recently been writing about the glories of their kings, were now writing about the coming of the pagans. The raids were a sign of things to come. The Vikings, with their superior longships and their battle-hardened resolve, were a force that the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were ill-equipped to handle. The raids began as hit-and-run attacks, but they quickly grew in size and scale. By the mid-9th century, the Vikings were no longer just raiding. They were wintering in England, setting up fortified camps from which they could launch their attacks. They were not interested in just stealing. They were interested in staying. They were looking for new homes, new lands, and new kingdoms to rule. The Anglo-Saxons, with their kings and their feuding kingdoms, were no match for this unified, relentless force. The Vikings, who often operated as a great heathen army, were a single, focused entity. They would strike a kingdom, force the king to pay a huge sum of money, a tribute known as the Danegeld, and then move on to the next one. This was a kind of protection racket on a national scale. The kings, who were often more concerned with fighting each other than with fighting the Vikings, were easy prey. The unity that had been so elusive for the Anglo-Saxons was now being forced upon them by the very people who were trying to conquer them. The Viking threat would eventually lead to the rise of a new kind of king, a king who would understand that the only way to defeat the Vikings was to unite his people. This was a time of immense fear and uncertainty, a time when the Anglo-Saxons had to make a choice, to unite or to be conquered. The story of England was about to take another dramatic turn, and the stage was set for the rise of its most famous king, a king who would stand against the tide and save his people from utter annihilation. The relentless Viking raids and the expansion of the great heathen army pushed the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the brink of collapse. One by one, the kingdoms of the Heptarchy fell. East Anglia was conquered, its king, Edmund, martyred for his faith. Northumbria was overrun, and its capital, York, became a Viking stronghold. Mercia, the great kingdom of Offa, was carved up and diminished. Only one kingdom, the small but resilient kingdom of Wessex in the south of England, remained. At its head was a young king, a man who would one day be known as Alfred the Great. He was not just a warrior. He was a scholar, a man who loved books and learning, and a man who understood that a king's duty was not just to fight, but to lead. He was the kind of guy who, in a modern movie, would be played by a very serious, thoughtful actor, not a muscle-bound one. Alfred's reign began in 871, and it was a baptism by fire. He inherited a kingdom that was under constant threat from the Vikings. He fought battle after battle, a kind of unending war of attrition. At one point, the situation became so desperate that he was forced to flee, taking refuge in the marshes of Athelney in Somerset. This was a low point for the Anglo-Saxons, a moment when their very existence seemed to be in doubt. It was during this time that the famous legend of the burnt cakes emerged, a story that, while almost certainly not true, perfectly captures the image of a king who was at his lowest, a king who was forced to live among his people as one of them. He was not a distant ruler. He was a man in the mud, hiding from the enemy. But Alfred was not a man to be defeated. While in hiding, he used the time to plan, to organize, and to prepare. He built a network of spies and informants, and he began to muster his forces in secret. He knew that he could not defeat the Vikings in a single, decisive battle. He had to be strategic, to be patient, and to use every resource at his disposal. He was a master of logistics, a king who understood that an army marches on its stomach, not just on its courage. He was a man who understood that you could not just fight a war. You had to plan for one. Alfred's leadership was a turning point. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to truly unite his people against the Vikings. He was a symbol of their resistance, a man who represented their hopes and their fears. He wasn't just fighting for his kingdom. He was fighting for the survival of the Anglo-Saxon way of life. He was a king who understood that the old fragmented system of the Heptarchy was a weakness, and that the only way to survive was to unite. His story is one of perseverance and resilience, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, a single determined leader can make all the difference. He was not a king who was born to greatness. He was a king who had greatness thrust upon him, and he rose to the occasion. The turning point in Alfred's long and arduous struggle against the Vikings came in 878 at the Battle of Edington. Alfred, having spent months in hiding and gathering his forces in secret, finally emerged from the marshes of Athelney and led his army against the Viking leader Guthrum. The battle was a decisive one, a moment when the tide of the Viking conquest was finally and definitively turned back. It was not a battle won by sheer numbers. It was a battle won by strategy, by the unity of the Anglo-Saxon forces, and by Alfred's unyielding will. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers describe the battle in vivid, if not entirely objective terms, and the victories was seen as a sign that God was on their side. The Vikings were not just defeated, they were routed, and Guthrum himself was cornered and forced to sue for peace. The peace that followed the battle was a testament to Alfred's strategic mind. He could have simply massacred the Vikings, but he chose a different path. He forced Guthrum to convert to Christianity, a powerful symbolic act that showed that the Anglo-Saxon way of life had triumphed over the pagan one. He then drew a boundary line, creating a new territory for the Vikings to settle, a territory that became known as the Danelaw. This was a huge swathe of land in the north and east of England, a place where the Vikings would be governed by their own laws and customs, but a place that was now officially recognized as a part of England. It was a pragmatic solution, a way of containing the Viking threat without having to constantly fight them. It was a kind of compromise, a recognition that the Vikings were not going to disappear, and that the only way to live with them was to live with them on his own terms. The creation of the Danelaw was a huge moment in English history. It was a physical and political division of the island, a place where the two cultures would exist side by side, a place where the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings would eventually mix, a fact that can still be seen in the place names of modern-day England. The Viking legacy is in the words we use and the places we live. The names ending in by, like Derby and Grimsby or Thorpe, are a clear sign of Viking settlement. It was a time of immense cultural exchange, a time when the two peoples began to learn from each other. The Vikings, with their superior sailing skills and their love of trade, helped to open England up to the rest of the world. The Anglo-Saxons, with their advanced farming techniques and their love of learning, helped to civilize the Vikings. Alfred's victory at Edington was the high point of his reign, but his legacy was more than just a military one. He was a reformer who created a legal code, a military system, and a system of education. He was a king who understood that a nation was more than just its borders. It was its laws, its culture, and its people. He was the kind of king who would be the hero of a movie, a man who, against all odds, saved his people from oblivion. He was the last great Anglo-Saxon king, a man who built a foundation for a unified England, a foundation that would eventually be built upon by his successors. Alfred the Great's victory at Edington was not the end of the story. It was a new beginning. He had saved Wessex from a Viking conquest, but the rest of England was still in a state of chaos. The Danelaw was a huge part of the island, and the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Mercia and Northumbria, were still under Viking control. Alfred's goal, and the goal of his successors, was to do what had once seemed impossible, to reconquer England from the Vikings and to unite it under a single king. This was not a military campaign. It was a long, slow, and often frustrating process, a kind of chess match played over decades. The first moves were made by Alfred's children, his son Edward the Elder and his daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. They were a formidable duo, a kind of power couple who understood that the only way to win was to be relentless and strategic. They began to build a network of fortified towns, or burhs, a kind of defensive system that was designed to protect their kingdom and to serve as a base for their attacks. The burhs were not just forts. They were also centers of trade and administration, a kind of modern-day town planning in a very difficult era. This was a classic Alfredian move, a recognition that a strong army was nothing without a strong economy and a strong society to back it up. The reconquest was a slow and grinding process. Edward and Ethelflad would push into Viking territory, build a boor, and then move on to the next. They were not just fighting battles, they were also negotiating treaties, marrying off their children to local Viking leaders, and slowly but surely absorbing the Viking territories back into the Anglo-Saxon fold. This was a war of assimilation, a war that was fought as much with diplomacy as it was with a sword. The Vikings, who had been so good at conquering, were now finding themselves on the defensive. They were no longer a single, unified force. Their leaders were now squabbling over land and influence, and they were no match for the united and determined forces of Wessex and Mercia. The reconquest culminated in the reign of Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, who became the first king of a unified England in 927. He was a king who ruled over both Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, a king who was seen as the first true monarch of England. He was a man who understood that his kingdom was a diverse place, and he worked to create a legal code that was fair to both Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. He was a king who was not just a warrior, but a builder, a diplomat, and a man who was recognized as an equal by the great European rulers of his day. The reconquest of England was a monumental achievement, a triumph of strategy and perseverance. It was the moment when the Anglo-Saxons, after centuries of fighting, finally achieved what they had so long strived for, a single unified kingdom. It was a testament to the vision of Alfred and his successors, a vision that had been born in the mud of Athelney and had ended in a unified England. The story, however, was far from over. A new era was beginning, an era of relative peace, but the quiet would not last forever. The unified Kingdom of England, forged in the fires of the Viking Wars by Alfred and his successors, enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. The Anglo-Saxons, now a single people, were building a new society, one that was a blend of their old traditions and the new influences they had absorbed from the Vikings and from their continental neighbors. But this peace, as history often reminds us, was not destined to last. As the 10th century turned into the 11th, a new wave of Viking raids began, this time on a different scale. These were not just bands of warriors. They were large, professional armies, led by powerful kings who were not interested in just raiding. They were interested in conquest. The king who inherited this fragile peace was Ethelred II, a man whose name, noble counsel, was a cruel irony. He would forever be known as Ethelred the Unready, a nickname that meant ill-counseled and perfectly captured the essence of his disastrous reign. He was a king who was indecisive and ineffective, a man who was ill-equipped to handle the kind of threat that was coming his way. He tried to buy off the Vikings with a tribute known as the Danegeld, a policy that only seemed to encourage them to come back for more. It was a vicious cycle. The Vikings would raid, Ethelred would pay them off, and they would leave, only to return a few years later with a bigger army and a bigger demand for cash. The Anglo-Saxon people, who had fought so hard to be free of the Viking threat, were now being taxed to pay their enemies. Ethelred's reign was a time of immense internal strife. The nobles, who had once been united by the common threat, were now squabbling over power and influence. The burghs, which had been so effective under Alfred, were now in disrepair. The army, which had once been a unified force, was now fragmented and disorganized. The old ways were returning, the very ways that Alfred had so hard to fight against. The Viking raids, which had once been a problem, were now an existential threat, a cancer that was eating away at the heart of the kingdom. The most famous of these raids was led by the legendary Viking warrior Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. He was a ruthless and ambitious king who saw England as a prize to be won, not just a place to be raided. He led a series of devastating campaigns, pushing Ethelred to the brink of collapse. At one point, Ethelred was forced to flee to Normandy, the very place that his son would one day rule. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, a man who had failed to live up to the legacy of his ancestors. The reign of Ethelred the Unready was a clear example of how a great kingdom can be undone by a weak leader. He was a king who inherited a strong foundation, but he failed to build upon it. He was a man who, in a modern-day business, would have been fired for gross incompetence. He was a king who was unable to make the tough decisions, and his indecisiveness cost his people dearly. The story of England was about to take another dramatic turn, and the stage was being set for a final, epic showdown between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, a showdown that would lead to a new king and a new dynasty, but a showdown that would also lead to a final, permanent change in the history of the island. The reign of Ethelred the Unready was a catastrophe, but it was not the final word. After Sweyn Forkbeard's death, his son, a man named Canute, continued the Viking invasion. He was a ruthless and ambitious king, a man who had no intention of just raiding. He wanted to rule. In 1016, Canute defeated Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son, and became the king of England. This was a monumental moment, a clear sign that the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, which had been so carefully built by Alfred and his successors, had been replaced by a Viking one. Canute, however, was not like the raiders of old. He was a king who understood the value of a well-run kingdom. He was a pragmatic and clever ruler who, once he had conquered England, set about governing it in a way that was both fair and effective. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, a move that secured his power and linked him to a powerful continental dynasty. He also created a legal code that was based on the old Anglo-Saxon laws, and he appointed both Anglo-Saxons and Danes to his court. He was a king who ruled over a dual kingdom, a kingdom that was a blend of two different cultures. But Canute was more than just the king of England. He was also the king of Denmark, and eventually the king of Norway. He was the ruler of a great North Sea empire, a vast collection of lands that stretched from the shores of England to the fjords of Scandinavia. He was a king who understood that the future of his kingdom was not just in England, but in the wider world. He was a man who, in a modern sense, would have been a kind of CEO of a multinational corporation. He was a king who was not interested in fighting. He was interested in building an empire. The reign of Canute was a period of stability and relative peace. He brought an end to the Viking raids, and he allowed the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes to live together in peace. He was a king who, despite his Viking roots, was seen as a legitimate ruler by his Anglo-Saxon subjects. He was a man who had a reputation for wisdom and justice. The famous story of Canute and the tide, in which he commands the sea to not get his feet wet, is almost certainly a later fabrication, but it perfectly captures his reputation. He was a king who was wise enough to know his limits, a king who understood that even a great monarch cannot command the natural world. Canute's reign, however, was also a time of transition. He was a Viking king, but he was also a Christian king, and he embraced his new faith with a passion. He made a pilgrimage to Rome, a journey that showed his piety and his connection to the wider Christian world. He was a king who had, in a sense, been tamed by England. His reign was a kind of golden age, a time when the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes lived together in peace, but it was also a time that would not last. After his death, his empire would crumble, and the stage would be set for the return of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, a return that would be short-lived and would lead to the most famous battle in English history. The great North Sea Empire of Canute, for all its power and glory, did not long outlast its founder. After his death in 1035, his sons squabbled over his vast territories, and the empire quickly unraveled. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, who had been forced to accept a Viking king, now saw a chance to reclaim their throne. The man they chose was Edward the Confessor, the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. Edward had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy, a fact that would have a huge impact on his reign and on the future of England. He was a deeply pious man, a kind of saintly king who was more interested in prayer than in politics. He was a man who had been raised in a French court, and he brought with him French customs, French nobles, and a French way of thinking. This was a subtle but profound change, a kind of cultural invasion that would pave the way for a much larger one. Edward's reign, which lasted from 1042 to 1066, was a period of fragile peace. He was a weak king, a man who was unable to control the powerful Anglo-Saxon earls who had helped him to the throne. The most powerful of these earls was Godwin of Wessex, a man who was the de facto ruler of England. He and his sons, especially Harold, were the real power behind the throne. They were a powerful, ambitious family, and they were the ones who truly governed England. Edward, a man who had no children, was a kind of a puppet king, a figurehead who was more interested in building a great cathedral at Westminster than in governing his kingdom. Edward's piety and his childlessness would be his most lasting legacy. He made a vow of chastity, a decision that meant he would have no heir to his throne. This was a huge problem. In a world where a king's lineage was everything, a childless king was a ticking time bomb. The question of who would succeed him became a central issue, a political football that was kicked around by all the major players of the time. Who would inherit the throne? Would it be one of the powerful Anglo-Saxon earls? Would it be a man with a distant claim to the throne, a man like the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada? Or would it be a man from Normandy, a man who had been a guest in Edward's court, a man who had a strong claim and a stronger army? The answer to that question would not be decided by law or by tradition. It would be decided by force. Edward's reign was a kind of interregnum, a time of quiet before a storm. It was a time when the powerful Anglo-Saxon earls were becoming too powerful, a time when the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty was running out of steam. It was a time when the Norman influence, which had been so subtle and so slow, was beginning to take root. The stage was being set for a final, epic showdown, a showdown that would decide the fate of England once and for all. The death of Edward the Confessor would be the spark that lit the flame, a moment that would change the course of history. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 was the event that everyone had been dreading. He died childless and without a clear, designated heir, and the resulting power vacuum was filled almost immediately by a series of claimants to the English throne. The most powerful of these was Harold Godwinson, the son of the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex. He was a man who had, for all intents and purposes, been ruling England for years. He was a skilled politician and a formidable warrior, a man who had the support of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the backing of the people. On the very day of Edward's burial, Harold was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. His claim to the throne was based on the fact that he was the most powerful man in England and that he was the late king's chosen successor. He was a man who was ready to be king, and he was ready to fight to keep his crown. But Harold's claim was not the only one. There were two other men who believed that they had a rightful claim to the throne. The first was Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, a man who was a living legend, a Viking warrior who had fought from Constantinople to the North Atlantic. He had a claim to the throne based on an old treaty that had been made between a previous Norwegian king and a previous English king. He was a man who had the support of his own people and the backing of a large professional army. He was a force to be reckoned with, a kind of one-man army who was ready to reclaim the Viking legacy in England. The second and most famous of the claimants was William, Duke of Normandy. He was a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, a fact that gave him a claim to the throne. He also claimed that Edward had promised him the throne in a secret meeting years before, and he had the support of the Pope and the backing of a unified and disciplined army. He was a man who, unlike Harold, had the support of the church. He was a man who, in a modern sense, would have been a kind of CEO of a hostile takeover. He was a man who was ready to cross the English Channel and to take what he believed was rightfully his. Harold's reign was a tumultuous one, a kind of 10-month war. He was a man who had to fight on all fronts. He had to deal with internal rebellions, and he had to prepare for a war with two different enemies. He was a man who, in a modern sense, would have been a kind of general who had to fight a war on two different fronts. He was a man who had to make a choice, and he chose to fight. He was a man who, despite the odds, was ready to defend his kingdom and his crown. He was the last Anglo-Saxon king, a man who, in the end, would be defeated by a series of events that were far beyond his control. The year 1066 was a year of 3 kings and 2 invasions, and it was all happening at once. Harold Godwinson, having just taken the throne, knew he had to act fast. He had to defend his kingdom against 2 different enemies, and he had to do it with an army that was not as disciplined or as unified as the armies he was about to face. He chose to deal with the Norwegian threat first. The Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, had landed in the north of England near the city of York, and he was being supported by Harold's own brother, Tostig. This was a personal betrayal, a kind of family feud that was being played out on a national stage. Harold, a man who was not going to let his brother take his kingdom, gathered his forces and began a long, arduous march north. The march was a grueling one, over 185 miles, and it was done in a very short amount of time. It was a testament to Harold's determination and to the loyalty of his men. The march was a kind of race against time, a race to get to the north before Harold Hardrada could consolidate his power. The two armies met at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066. It was a vicious and bloody battle, and it was a complete and utter triumph for Harold. The Norwegians, who had been caught by surprise, were completely defeated. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and the Norwegian threat was ended. It was a monumental victory, a clear sign that Harold was a great warrior and a great king. But the victory came at a great cost. Harold's army was exhausted and depleted, and he had no time to rest. Just 3 days after the battle, a messenger arrived with news that would change the course of English history forever. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast of England, near the town of Pevensey. He had brought with him a huge army, a professional force that was well disciplined and well equipped. Harold had no choice but to turn around and march south, and he had to do it with an army that was weary and worn out. He made a fatal decision. He did not wait for the rest of his army to catch up with him. He marched straight to meet William, a decision that would prove to be his undoing. The Battle of Hastings, which would be fought just a few weeks later, was the final act of this great drama. It was a battle that would decide the fate of England once and for all. It was a battle that would pit an exhausted Anglo-Saxon army against a fresh, well-rested Norman one. It was a battle that was a culmination of centuries of Anglo-Saxon history. The stage was set for the final, epic showdown, a showdown that would end a dynasty and begin a new one, a showdown that would forever be etched in the annals of history. The great drama of 1066 came to its climax on a hill near the town of Hastings. The date was October 14th, and the battle that would be fought there would change the course of English history forever. Harold Godwinson, having just won a monumental victory in the north, had made a forced march south. His army, a mix of exhausted veterans from Stamford Bridge and fresh but less disciplined levies, took up a defensive position on Senlac Hill. They were a formidable force in their own right, armed with the famous Viking battle axes that could cleave a man in half and a deep sense of loyalty to their king. Harold, a man who had fought his way to the throne, was not going to give it up without a fight. He took up his position at the center of the shield wall, a kind of human wall of shields and spears that was almost impenetrable. William of Normandy, on the other hand, had had weeks to prepare. His army was a professional force, a mix of knights on horseback, archers, and foot soldiers. They were a disciplined and well-equipped force, a kind of modern-day army facing a more traditional one. William was a master of tactics, a man who understood that a battle was not just about brute force. It was about strategy and cunning. He arrayed his forces at the foot of the hill, a kind of chessboard waiting to be played. The battle itself was a long, brutal affair that lasted all day. The Normans, with their cavalry, charged up the hill again and again, but the English shield wall held firm. The Norman arrows, which had been so effective in other battles, bounced off the shields of the English. It was a stalemate, a kind of endless, grinding conflict. But William, a man who was not going to be defeated, had a plan. He ordered his men to pretend to retreat, a classic military feint that was designed to lure the English out of their defensive position. The English, who had been holding their position all day, saw the retreat as a sign of victory, and they broke their shield wall and charged down the hill. This was the moment that William had been waiting for. The Norman cavalry, having been given the signal, turned around and charged into the disorganized English, slaughtering them in a brutal, one-sided battle. The battle ended when Harold himself was killed. The accounts of his death are varied. Some say he was shot in the eye with an arrow, a detail that was famously captured in the Bayeux Tapestry. Others say he was simply cut down by a group of Norman knights. However he died, his death was the end of the Anglo-Saxon resistance. With their king dead, the English army broke and fled. The victory was complete. The Battle of Hastings was a defining moment in English history. It was a moment that ended the Anglo-Saxon era and began the Norman one. It was a moment that brought a new language, a new culture, and a new way of life to England. It was a moment that changed the face of the island forever. The legacy of the Anglo-Saxons was not erased, but it was forever changed by the events of that single, bloody day. The Norman Conquest was not a single event that ended at the Battle of Hastings. It was a long, brutal process that would take years to complete. William, now known as William the Conqueror, had won the battle, but he had not yet won the kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, who had been defeated on the battlefield, were not ready to give up. They still had a claim to the throne, and they still had the support of the people. William, a man who understood power, knew that he had to be both ruthless and pragmatic. He had to show the Anglo-Saxons that he was not just a conqueror. He was a legitimate king, a king who was here to stay. William's first move was to march on London. He did not attack the city directly. Instead, he took a more strategic approach, surrounding the city and cutting off its supply lines. The Anglo-Saxon leaders, seeing that they were in a no-win situation, finally surrendered. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the very same place where Harold had been crowned just a few months before. This was a powerful symbolic act, a way of showing the Anglo-Saxons that the old dynasty was dead and a new one had begun. But the coronation was not the end of the resistance. The Anglo-Saxons, especially in the north, continued to rebel. The rebellions were a kind of guerrilla warfare, a constant source of friction that William had to deal with. He responded with a brutal and systematic campaign of suppression that became known as the Harrying of the North. He burned villages, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock. His goal was not just to defeat the rebels, it was to starve the entire region into submission. The Harrying of the North was a ruthless and effective way of showing the Anglo-Saxons that rebellion would not be tolerated. It was a clear message that William was a king who would not hesitate to use force to get his way. The harrying of the north, however, was not the only way that William secured his power. He also began a systematic process of replacing the Anglo-Saxon nobility with his own Norman followers. The Anglo-Saxon earls and nobles, who had been the real power behind the throne for centuries, were stripped of their lands and their titles. Their lands were given to William's knights and barons, men who had fought with him at Hastings and who were now loyal to him and him alone. This was a kind of feudal revolution, a complete and total change in the social and political structure of England. The Norman Conquest, however, was not just a military and political change, it was a cultural one as well. The Normans brought with them a new language, a new legal system, and a new way of life. The Anglo-Saxon language, which had been spoken for centuries, was now a language of the peasants. The language of the court, the law, and the nobility was now French. This was a profound change, a kind of cultural schism that would last for centuries. The Anglo-Saxon world was not erased, but it was forever changed by the Norman influence. The two cultures would eventually merge, but it would take centuries for them to do so. The legacy of the Norman Conquest is still visible today in the place names, the language, and the laws of modern-day England. The Norman Conquest marked a decisive end to the Anglo-Saxon era and the beginning of a new one. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was largely replaced, and their culture, while not erased, was relegated to a secondary status. The Norman lords, with their French language and their continental customs, were now the rulers of England. They brought with them a new system of governance, a new legal system, and a new way of organizing society. This was a profound change, a kind of social and political revolution that would forever alter the course of English history. The Normans, however, were not just conquerors. They were also builders. They began to build a new kind of fortress, the great stone castles that we still see today. These castles, with their motte and bailey design, were not just symbols of power. They were also a way of controlling the Anglo-Saxon population. They were a kind of physical manifestation of Norman rule, a clear sign that the new kings were here to stay. The Normans also brought with them a new kind of administration. William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book, a great survey of all the land and property in England. It was a kind of census, a way of knowing exactly what he had conquered and who owed him taxes. It was a clear sign that the new king was a man who was interested in order and in a systematic way of governing. It was a kind of bureaucratic masterpiece, a testament to the Norman way of thinking. The Domesday Book was a legal document, a kind of record of what everyone owned and what everyone owed. It was a book that, in a modern sense, would have been a kind of tax record. It was a way of showing the Anglo-Saxons that the new king was in charge and that the old ways were over. The Norman Conquest also brought England into the mainstream of European politics. The English kings were now also dukes of Normandy, a fact that would forever link them to the political machinations of the continent. The English court, which had once been insular and isolated, was now a part of the great network of European royalty. The English kings were now marrying French princesses, fighting French wars, and speaking a French dialect. This was a profound change, a kind of cultural and political shift that would forever alter the course of English history. The Anglo-Saxons, who had once been a people who looked inward, were now a people who were forced to look outward. The legacy of the Anglo-Saxons, however, was not entirely lost. Their language, while no longer spoken by the elite, was still the language of the people. It would eventually merge with the new French language to create a new language, English, a language that is a fascinating blend of two different cultures. The old Anglo-Saxon laws and customs would also survive, and they would eventually be incorporated into the new Norman legal system. The old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would be replaced by new Norman counties, but the old names and the old identities would remain. The story of England was not a story of a culture that was erased. It was a story of a culture that was transformed, a kind of slow and steady evolution that would eventually lead to a new, more complex identity. The final act of this great drama was not a battle. It was a slow and quiet assimilation. The story of medieval Britain, from the fall of Rome to the rise of the Normans, is a saga of immense change. It is a story of a people, the Britons, who were pushed to the fringes of their own island by a new people, the Anglo-Saxons. It is a story of a kingdom, England, that was forged in the fires of conflict and was, for a time, a part of a vast Viking empire. And it is a story of a final, dramatic invasion that would change the course of English history forever. The legacy of this period is not just in the ruins of the Roman villas or the great stone castles of the Normans. It is in the very fabric of the nation itself. It is in the language we speak, a language that is a blend of Anglo-Saxon, French, and Latin. It is in the place names, the laws, and the customs that have been passed down through the centuries. It is a story of a people who were a blend of many different cultures, a story that is still being written today. And so, his story sank into legend, a legend of a people who, after centuries of fighting, found a kind of uneasy peace. The great figures of the era, the shadowy Vortigern, the fierce Penda, the wise Alfred, and the ill-fated Harold, all became part of a tapestry, a kind of collective memory of a time when the world was new and the future was uncertain. They were not just kings and warriors. They were symbols of a people's struggle for survival. Their stories, like the old Roman roads, are still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. The story of the Anglo-Saxons is a story of a people who came to an island as invaders and who in the end became a new nation. They were a people who were shaped by the people they conquered and the people who, in the end, conquered them. They were a people who, in their struggle for survival, created a new identity, a new language, and a new way of life. They were a people who, in the end, were not defeated. They were simply changed. And so, their story too ended not with a whimper, but with the quiet, gentle whisper of history, a whisper that tells us that no story is ever truly over. The sun is setting on this long, long tale. The mists are rolling in from the sea, and the great kings and warriors of the past are fading into the shadows. The castles stand silent. The old battlefields are now just green fields, and the longships are just a memory. The story has been told. The journey is over. It's time to rest now, to let the images of this ancient world drift away on the soft evening breeze. Close your eyes and let the quiet of history carry you into a peaceful slumber. Good night.